Chapter 8 was the last chapter we covered, and that will be on your midterm. I'm only going to go over the problems that deal with matrices because everything else should be so fresh in your head that you won't need a review. So anything with the star, again, is a no calculator problem. Our topics that could show up on our midterm are systems of three equations, matrix multiplication, determinants, systems of nonlinear equations, linear programming, and then partial fraction decomposition. So I'm going to start off with systems of equations. Even though the topic says solve each system by your method of choice, I suggest you do it the matrice way, just in case that pops up on the exam, and this is just more practice for you. So it gives me a system, and what I did is I already turned it into a matrix. So remember, you just leave out all your variables and then do 3 rows and then put a line for equals. Our goal in a matrix when we're using it to solve a system is to get a 1, 0, 0, then a number 1, 0, a number 1, and then it doesn't matter what these numbers are. So remember, you want 1s on the diagonal and then 0 below it. And we always start with column 1, and we always work our way down. So we're going to start with 1, then we're going to get 0 here, and then we're going to get 0 here before we move on to the next column. However, when we try to rearrange this, remember, we're just working with a row, not the columns. So I know that I need a 1 in this spot here first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look and see if any other row has a 1 in that spot. And I notice that row 3 does. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch row 1 and row 3. So when I do that now, my matrix is going to become 1, negative 3, 2, 8, 4, 2, negative 3, 10. So row 2 stays the same. And then row 3 is going to become 2, negative 1, 1, 10. So I got my 1 in this spot, which means I'm done with that. Now I'm going to have to get a 0 here and a 0 here. So I'm going to start with this 4. So 4 plus something has to give me 0. So whenever I want a 0, I have to add 2 rows together. So first, 4 plus negative 4 would give me 0. So that's what I'm going to multiply row 1 by. So I'm going to do negative 4, row 1. And add it to row 2. So remember, whatever row comes second is going to be my new row. So only row 2 is changing here. Now I gotta multiply negative 4 by row 1. Well, row 1 is this part here. So negative 4 times 1 would give me negative 4. Negative 3 times negative 4 is 12. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8. And then 8 times negative 4 is negative 32. I have to now add that new row to row 2, which is 4, 2, negative 3, 10. And when I add it, my new row becomes 0, 14, negative 11, and negative 22. So I'm going to replace this part only in row 2. I'm going to rewrite my matrix. Row 1 stays the same. Row 2 changes to that 0, 14, negative 11, negative 22. And row 3 stays the same. So that's 2, negative 1, 1, and 10. So I got my 0 in this spot, which I wanted, and now I need to get a 0 in this spot. So 2 plus something has to give me 0, and that would be negative 2. So I'm going to multiply row 1 now by negative 2. So notice how when I want zeros in column 1, I use row 1, multiply it by whatever number would add to 0, and then add it to that other row. So whatever you want to get zeros in column 1, use row 1. So negative 2 times row 1 would give me negative 2 times 1, which is negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 3, which is 6. Negative 2 times negative 2 times 2, which is negative 4. And then negative 2 times 8, which is negative 16. I'm going to add this to row 3 now. And I would get 0, 5, negative 3, negative 6. So this is now my new row 3. So I'm going to rewrite my matrix. This time, only row 3 changes. So row 1 stays the same, row 2 stays the same, and then row 3 becomes 0, 5, negative 3, negative 6. So I see that column 1 has that 1, 0, 0, and that means I'm completely done with column 1, which means at this point, I'm going to stop using row 1. So whenever column 1 is done, you stop using row 1. Our next goal is to get a 1 here. So whenever I want a 1, I just multiply that row. So 14 times something gives me 1. And all I do is I take whatever number's there, my highlighted number, and I flip it. So technically it's 14 over 1, so I'm going to flip it so it becomes 1 over 14. I'm going to multiply that by row 2 now. So you can either do it off to the side, or you can just rewrite your matrix and then we'll replace row 2. So I'm going to rewrite my matrix. Rows 1 and 3 are going to stay the same. And now I'm going to take row 2 and I'm going to multiply it by 1 over 14. So 0 times 1 over 14 is 0. 14 times 1 over 14 is 1. Negative 11 times 1 over 14 is negative 11 over 14. And then negative 22 times 1 over 14, if I simplify that, that is negative 11 over 7. So you can use a calculator to simplify that. So I got my 1 there. Now I want a 0 here. So whenever I need a 0, I multiply a row and then add it to another. So 5 plus something gives me 0. That number would be negative 5. So 5 plus negative 5 would give me 0. So I'm going to multiply row 2 by negative 5 and add it to row 3. So when I multiply row 2 by negative 5, I'm going to get negative 5 times 0, which is 0. Negative 5 times 1, which is negative 5. Negative 5 times 11 over 14, which is 33 over 14. Or I'm sorry, 55 over 14. And then I would do negative 11 over 7 times negative 5, which is 53 over 7. And then I'm going to add that to row 3 now. So again, use your calculator here. So 0 plus 0 is 0. Negative 5 plus 5 is 0. 55 over 14 plus negative 3 is 13 over 14. And then 53 over 7 plus negative 6 is 13 over 7. So that's going to be my new row 3. So rows 1 and 2 are going to stay the same. This time row 3 is going to be 0, 0, 13 over 14, 13 over 7. So now if I notice column 2 is done, so I stop using row 2. All I'm left with is to get a 1 where this spot is, so whenever I want a 1, I just multiply the row. 13 over 14 times something would give me 1, so remember all I have to do is flip it. So instead of 13 over 14, I'm going to multiply this row 3 by 14 over 13. So I'm going to rewrite my matrix. Rows 1 and 2 stay the same. And row 3 is going to become 0 times 14 over 13 is 0. 0 times 14 over 13 is 0. 13 over 14 times 14 over 13 is 1. And then 13 over 7 times 14 over 13 is 2. So at this point, now I can figure out what x, y, and z are. So I start with row 3, and that's always going to tell me what z is. So here z is 2. So remember your columns go x, y, z, and then equals. So here I see x and y have 0 in front, which means they just disappear. Z has 1 in front, so it's 1z equals 2, which is just 2. For my y, it would be 1y minus 11 over 14z equals negative 11 over 7. So when I plug in 2, I would get y minus 11 over 14 times 2, which if you want to simplify that right away, you would get minus 11 over 7 equals negative 11 over 7. So when you add that to the other side, you're going to get a y value of 0. And then lastly, we have to solve for x. So we take this first equation and it says 1x minus 3y plus 2z equals 8. So I plug in 0 for y and 2 for z. So I get x plus 4 equals 8, which means x is 4. So my solution is 4, 0, 2. So I would try number 2 using the matrices way, or if you're not good at solving with elimination, do it that way, but make sure you know how to do it both ways. Next one is multiplying a matrix. So it wants us to find AB. So A is a 3 by 2 matrix. So remember, it's rows by column. So there's 3 rows, 2 columns. B is a 2 by 3 matrix, which means there's 2 rows, 3 columns. So when I multiply AB, it will end up being, now I take how many rows are in A, which is 3, and then how many columns are in B, which is 3. So this is going to end up being a 3 by 3. So to do this, remember whatever letter comes first, that's what row you're taking. Whatever letter comes second is the column you're taking. So I'm only doing rows in A and then columns in B. So to figure out the first spot, that is row 1 times column 1. So I do the dot product. So it is negative 1 times 1 plus 0 times 0. So that gives me my first spot. So now I'm still in row 1, but I'm moving to column 2. So now this is going to be negative 1 times 3 plus 0 times negative 1. And finally, row 1, column 3, and that's going to be negative 1 times 4 plus 0 times 1. And then notice how I'm done with row 1 because I know it's a 3 by 3, so it only has 3 columns, and it's 3, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to go on to row 2. So same process, but this time with row 2. So row 2 and then column 1. So it's going to be 2 times 1 plus negative 3 times 0. Then I go to column 2 now, still in row 2. So it's going to be 2 times 3 plus negative 3 times negative 1. And then finally I have to do column 3. So it's 2 times 4 plus negative 3 times 1. So now row 2 is done. And I go on to row 3, column 1. So now this is going to be 1 times 1 plus 1 times 0. Then column 2. So 1 times 3 plus 1 times negative 1. And then finally column 3. So 1 times 4 plus 1 times 1. And that's how I set it up. So look at the row, do the dot product with the column. Now I just simplify. So since this is star, this means no calculator, so I would simplify it step by step. So negative 1 times 1 is negative 1, 0 times 0 is 0. In row 1, column 2, negative 1 times 3 is negative 3, 0 times negative 1 is 0. And then negative 4, or negative 1 times 4 is negative 4, 0 times 1 is 0. And then I'm going to do that with all the other rows. So 2 times 1 is 2, negative 3 times 0 is 0, 2 times 3 is 6, negative 3 times negative 1 is 3, 2 times 4 is 8, negative 3 times 1 is negative 3. And then my last row, 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 0 is 0, 1 times 3 is 3, 1 times negative 1 is negative 1, 1 times 4 is 4, 1 times 1 is 1. And then I just add those together. So negative 1 times 1, or 0 is negative 1, negative 3 times 0 is negative 3, negative 4 plus 0 is 4, not times, you're adding. 2 plus 0 is 2, 6 plus 3 is 9, 8 minus 3 is 5, 1 plus 0 is 1, 3 minus 1 is 2, 4 plus 1 is 5. So that would be my answer. So just in case you're finding A, B for each, but if you look at number 2, that turns out to be a 2 by 2. So make sure you know how to tell when it's a 3 by 3 or a 2 by 2. The last thing we did with a matrix is find its determinant. So whenever it's a 3 by 3 or higher, you have to rewrite some columns. So if it's a 3 by 3, I rewrite the first 2 columns. If it's a 4 by 4, I rewrite the first 3 columns. 5 by 5, I rewrite the first 4 columns. What we do is then we are going to multiply our diagonals and add them together. So first I'm doing the on diagonals, and then I'll subtract the off diagonals. So this is matrix B, so I'm going to find the determinant of matrix B. I knew it was matrix B because it says B right there. And now for my diagonals. I see I have a diagonal of 1, 2, 5. So I'm going to multiply those numbers together. 1 times 2 times 5. Then I add the next diagonal, which is negative 10, 7, negative 19. So I'm going to do negative 10 times 7 times negative 19. Plus final diagonal, which is 5 times 3 times 4. So those are all my on diagonals. Now my off diagonals go the other way. So there's 1, 2, and 3. So since this is a 3 by 3, I'm going to have 3 diagonals each way. If it was a 4 by 4, that would be 4 diagonals each way. 5 by 5, 5 diagonals each way. And now I'm going to subtract the off diagonals. So I'm going to start with negative 10, 3, 5. So that's going to be negative 10 times 3 times 5 plus 1 times 7 times 4 plus 5 times 2 times negative 19. And now from this point we're just going to simplify. So again, the hardest part was just setting it up. Now it's just basic algebra. So 1 times 5 times 2 is 10. Negative 10 times 7 times negative 19 is positive 1330. 5 times 3 times 4 is positive 60. Minus negative 10 times 3 times 5 is negative 150. 1 times 7 times 4 is positive 28. And then 5 times 2 times negative 19 is negative 190. So simplify what's in parentheses first. So 10 plus 1330 plus 60 would give me 1400. Minus negative 50 plus 28 minus 190 would give me negative 312. So now I see I have a minus minus, so really I'm adding the two together. So my determinant of B would be 1712. So I have 3 problems like that. The rest of this should be fresh in your head just because you took a test on it not too long ago. So once you're done, you can check your answers.